Imagine standing at the edge of a belief that has shaped your entire life, the way you see yourself, the way you react to others, and the way you interpret every victory or disappointment. What if you discovered that this belief might not be true? Not in any deep or final sense. What if it was simply a habit of thought, a lens you could put down and pick up again? The question sounds small, but it is the key to freedom. The pragmatic method begins with one radical idea, that truth is not something frozen in the sky. It is something that works, something that proves itself in the living of life. And if a belief does not work for you, if it keeps you small, anxious, or trapped, then maybe it was never true for you in the first place. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, once said that the meaning of any belief lies in the practical difference it makes in your life. He wasn't asking you to debate philosophy, but to test it through living. If a belief brings you peace, strength, or clarity, it earns its place. If it only feeds guilt, fear, or paralysis, then it fails the test. The world is not waiting for perfect theories. It is waiting for lived experiments. You can think of this method as emotional science. You take an idea, and instead of asking, "Is it absolutely true?" you ask, "What happens when I act as if it is true for a week, for a day, or even just for one moment?" Take something simple but heavy, like the belief that you are not enough. Most people carry this like invisible armor. It shapes how they love, how they work, how they show up. They compare themselves endlessly, shrink from joy, and overthink every compliment. Imagine applying the pragmatic method to it. Instead of fighting or affirming it, you ask, "What happens when I move through the next hour believing the opposite? What would it feel like to walk into a room, not with arrogance, but quiet sufficiency? What changes in my body? What choices open up?" That is the experiment. The goal is not to prove the belief, wrong by logic, but to test its consequences in real time. There was once a young designer who believed she wasn't creative enough. She followed tutorials, she copied others, and every time she looked at her work, she saw flaws. One day her mentor asked her to try something unusual. For 1 week, pretend that creativity is not a gift, but a muscle that grows when used. She tried it. She stopped waiting for inspiration and just made small, ugly things every day. By the end of that week, her mind shifted. She didn't suddenly believe she was a genius, but she no longer waited for permission to create. That tiny test changed her path. That is the pragmatic method in action. This method invites you to stop debating life in your head and start gathering evidence through experience. It treats beliefs not as sacred laws, but as tools to be tested. Some work beautifully for a while and then stop working as you grow. That is normal. Growth means retiring old truths that once protected you, but now confine you. The child's truth that the world is dangerous may keep them safe in early years, but if carried into adulthood, it breeds anxiety and distrust. The pragmatic lens says keep what helps, release what harms, and test again, tomorrow, tonight. You can try this small experiment. Write down one belief that quietly shapes your choices. Maybe it's "I'm not disciplined," or "people always leave," or "success means suffering." Then write one sentence starting with, "What if the opposite were true?" For just today, do not argue with it. Just hold it gently and notice how your behavior shifts. The mind is not a courtroom, it is a laboratory. You are not defending truth, you are exploring usefulness. William James's insight is that life is constantly testing us whether we participate or not. Every action, every hesitation reveals what we truly believe. If you say you believe in kindness but treat yourself with cruelty, the evidence contradicts your claim. If you believe in freedom but live bound by fear, your results disprove your faith. The pragmatic method asks us to align inner claims with outer consequences, not through guilt, but through curiosity. Think of your beliefs as seeds. Some grow into tall trees of calm and confidence, others into weeds of self-doubt. The soil is your lived experience. The only way to know which seed belongs is to plant it, water it, and observe. The mind can argue forever, but the body always knows when something is life-giving. You feel it in your breathing, in the way time softens in your hands. That feeling is not mystical, it is data, emotional evidence of truth. The beauty of this method is that it releases you from the burden of absolute certainty. You no longer need to have the perfect worldview. Before acting, you act first, observe and learn. The belief that passes this test becomes your truth until it doesn't anymore. Then you begin again. The pragmatic path is a spiral, not a straight line. Every cycle brings more humility and more freedom, because you realize how much of life can be gently tested instead of fearfully obeyed. So as you listen to this, remember that no belief, no matter how sacred or ancient, is above question. You do not need to destroy your old ideas. You only need to test them gently through your own days. That is how truth becomes personal, not something handed down, but something lived and renewed. This is the first step of the pragmatic method, to replace the need to be right with the courage to experiment, to trade dogma for data, and in that simple shift find a way of living that finally feels like your own. The pain that keeps most people stuck inside their own minds is not ignorance, it is attachment to untested beliefs. Every person builds a private world made of assumptions about love, worth, time and failure. These ideas are not chosen consciously. They are absorbed like air from family, culture, and fear. When we were children, we watched how others reacted to life and quietly built our inner rules from that. Some people learned that love must be earned through exhaustion. Others learned that speaking up brings rejection. Some even learned that comfort is dangerous because it will be taken away. The pragmatic method begins by seeing these rules not as fate but as choices we never knew we made, and if they were learned, they can be unlearned. Many carry their pain like armor, believing that it keeps them safe. But protection built on illusion soon becomes a prison. There is a woman who stays late at work every night, not because she loves her job, but because she believes being busy proves her value. She cannot rest without guilt. Her belief is invisible, but it drives her every move, and when she finally collapses from burnout, she wonders why life feels empty. The pragmatic method would not scold her for working too much. It would simply invite her to test what happens if she rests and still considers herself worthy just for a day. She may feel terror rise, but underneath, it might be the first taste of real freedom. The test itself is the medicine. Every belief tries to protect something, even the ones that hurt. They are survival codes written by past experiences. The mind does not ask if they are still useful. It only repeats what once kept you alive. But life changes and the code must evolve. The pragmatic method is like a software update for the soul. You pause and ask, what happens when I stop running this old script? What would happen if I didn't assume people must like me for me to be safe, or that success requires self-betrayal? These questions sound small, but they are seismic shifts in identity. They break the illusion that belief equals truth. William James understood that philosophy should be lived, not worshipped. He called truth what works when lived consistently. If an idea increases the flow of life within you, it deserves to be called true. If it shrinks your world and drains your spirit, it is false, no matter how respected the source. This way of seeing brings compassion, because it stops dividing people into right and wrong. Instead, it asks what helps you thrive and what harms you. The moment you test this in your own life, judgment begins to soften. Think of a young man who grew up believing emotions were weakness. He hides behind humor and logic, but wonders why his relationships always collapse. One day, during an argument with his partner, he feels tears rising, and this time, instead of swallowing them, he lets them fall. For the first time he watches the other person soften instead of pull away, the world did not end. The belief failed its test. That night, he sits quietly, realizing that strength might mean something very different than he was taught. This is the turning point when testing a belief changes who you are. The pain of change is that it feels like betrayal. You will be tempted to go back to old habits because they feel safe even when they hurt. The familiar misery seems easier than the unfamiliar peace. The pragmatic method warns that when you start testing your beliefs, your identity will protest. It will whisper that you are losing yourself, but what you are losing is the false self that survived through repetition. To stay with the experiment, you must allow discomfort without deciding it means danger. A simple exercise can help tonight. When you notice emotional tension, Ask what belief is being tested right now. Maybe someone criticizes you and you feel defensive. Ask what belief about myself makes this hurt. If you find the sentence, for example, I must be perfect to be loved, then gently add the test, what if imperfection connects me more deeply than perfection does? Then live that for one conversation, one interaction, watch what happens. That is how testing becomes transformation. The pragmatic method does not demand blind optimism. It accepts that some beliefs must be held firmly, such as compassion, honesty, and curiosity. But even these should be lived as practices, not slogans. A belief is not real until it survives contact with life. You can say, I believe in kindness, but only when you practice it toward your own mistakes does it become embodied. This is what James meant by truth as experience, not as abstraction. Every person eventually faces a moment when their cherished idea fails. To protect them, maybe you believed that control could prevent loss or that intelligence could replace vulnerability. When those walls crack, you face a raw silence. The pragmatic method offers a hand here, not to fill the silence, but to help you. Listen. What does this moment teach me about what still works and what must be released? Sometimes the test reveals not a new belief, but a need for stillness before the next one arises. Over time, the method becomes a quiet companion. You stop demanding certainty from yourself or others. You start to observe patterns like a scientist, noticing how certain beliefs generate tension while others bring ease. This awareness builds inner trust. You no longer fear being wrong, because being wrong only means finding what doesn't work. You begin to move through life like a river instead of a rock, flexible yet steady. So the pain of untested belief begins to dissolve when you turn curiosity toward it. Testing a belief does not destroy your identity, it refines it. Life becomes a continuous experiment, and every failure turns into data for wisdom. The pragmatic method teaches you that you are not your thoughts. You are the experimenter who can choose which thoughts to live and which to retire. Each test brings you closer to the version of yourself that acts from experience rather than inherited fear, and that is where true strength quietly begins. There comes a moment in every person's life when thinking alone is no longer enough, when reasoning and reading and collecting opinions no longer ease the ache of uncertainty. You can gather every philosophy and still feel lost because truth cannot be borrowed, it must be lived. This is where the pragmatic method becomes something more than an idea. It becomes a doorway to direct experience. William James did not want people to replace one belief system with another. He wanted them to test their beliefs in the field of real life. He believed that the true measure of any idea is found not in its poetry or logic, but in its power to heal confusion and help you act with more presence. Every belief is a tool, and tools are meant to be used, not worshipped. Imagine a person who believes deeply that they are unlucky. Life to them feels like a series of missed chances. They prepare for rejection before it even happens. They see evidence everywhere of their curse. Then one day, a friend challenges them to test the belief pragmatically. Instead of asking, "Is it true?" they ask, "What happens if I stop calling myself unlucky for 1 week and just observe life without that label?" The first day, nothing changes. The second day, they notice small acts of luck. They used to ignore a stranger holding the door, a message arriving at the right moment. By the end of the week, the world feels slightly softer. The friend asks again what worked better, living as if you were unlucky or as if life was unpredictable but generous. The answer becomes self-evident. This is the heartbeat of the method. It transforms fate into feedback. Most of us do not realize how often our beliefs create the results that confirm them. When you expect coldness, you behave defensively and receive it. When you expect rejection, you shrink and make connection impossible. The pragmatic method asks you to become aware of this loop not through guilt but through observation. It is not about blaming yourself for your outcomes, but about seeing how thought and reality dance together. What you call the world is often your belief reflected back at you. Life becomes a mirror test, showing you the shape of your own convictions. William James once described the mind as a stream ever flowing, never still. He meant that consciousness is not a fixed thing, but an ongoing movement. And beliefs are like stones placed in that stream, redirecting its flow. When a stone is heavy with fear, it blocks the current. When it is light with trust, it allows the water to move freely. The task is not to purify the river into perfection, but to keep it flowing. When you test your beliefs, you remove the stones that no longer belong. You do not have to know the full truth. You only need to know which ideas let life move again. A man once carried the belief that people always leave, so he never stayed long enough to be proven wrong. He moved from friendship to friendship, job to job, always leaving first, so he could feel in control. The pattern became unbearable. He decided to try one experiment for the next 3 months. He would not leave anything, not a conversation, not a commitment, without first staying 1 moment longer than he felt safe. It was agony at first, but something began to shift. His relationships deepened slightly. Work began to feel less threatening, and the world stopped feeling like an enemy. He had tested his belief and found it incomplete, not false but unfinished. Through staying, he learned that not everyone leaves, only that fear makes him go first. This subtle discovery cannot be found in books. It must be lived. Testing beliefs does not mean ignoring pain. It means turning pain into data. When something hurts you, ask, what idea about myself or life makes this pain sharper? If a belief says, I should not feel this, then the suffering doubles. The Pragmatic Method invites you to replace judgment with curiosity. Maybe the feeling is simply feedback, telling you that a belief is too small for your growth. When you treat emotions as evidence, not enemies, you begin to navigate with more accuracy. A practical way to begin is through what James might call living experiments. Choose one area of life that feels tight with frustration and write down the belief behind it. Maybe it is relationships never work, or I will never be disciplined. Then for the next 3 days, live as if the opposite might be true. Not as affirmation, but as observation. Watch your tone, your decisions, your body language. Notice the micro changes. The method does not demand faith, only attention. That attention is what begins to shift the pattern, because it breaks unconscious repetition. The Pragmatic Method honors uncertainty as sacred, because uncertainty is the doorway to discovery. When you stop insisting on absolute truth, you free yourself from dogma. The world becomes alive again, not as a set of rules, but as an unfolding process. You learn to listen to results, not opinions. The beautiful part is that this method applies to everything from love to purpose to spirituality. You can test prayer, meditation, goals, even hope itself by their fruits. If they bring you closer to life, they are true enough for now. Over time, you begin to notice that truth is not a single point, but a living rhythm. Some beliefs rise, serve, and fade, making space for new insight. This fluidity is not weakness, it is maturity. A river that stops moving becomes stagnant. Likewise, a mind that refuses to test its beliefs becomes rigid and defensive. The pragmatic path keeps the current alive because it trusts experience more than ego. You do not need to declare what is eternally right. You only need to live what is momentarily real. As you walk through this method, something gentle awakens. The world that once felt solid and harsh begins to soften. The mind stops shouting and starts listening. You feel less like a prisoner of belief and more like a participant in an ongoing experiment. You stop asking, am I right, and start asking, is this working? You stop fearing change and start collaborating with it. And slowly you realize that testing beliefs is not about dismantling life. It is about deepening your conversation with it. This is the quiet liberation that the Pragmatic Method offers to every human willing to see truth as movement rather than monument. There is something deeply human about wanting to hold on to certainty. We crave it because it feels like safety. But the truth is that certainty can become a cage. A belief repeated too long becomes invisible like air. You forget you are breathing, and yet it shapes everything you see. The Pragmatic Method is not about destroying belief. It is about making it conscious again, about remembering that you can choose how to see. The difference between living and merely existing lies in the willingness to test the story you tell yourself each day. William James understood that the world is not made up of fixed truths but of living possibilities waiting for you to participate in them. He called his philosophy a method for finding what works, and what works is anything that increases your sense of meaning and vitality. Imagine a teacher who has always believed she must sacrifice her own happiness for her students. She works long hours, never says no, and feels guilty for resting. Over time, her kindness turns bitter because exhaustion has hollowed it out. One evening, she remembers something her mentor once said, that service without self-respect becomes resentment. She decides to test a new belief that caring for herself might actually make her teaching deeper. The next morning, she takes one small act of rebellion. She drinks her coffee, in silence before opening her email. For the first time in months, she feels calm. The lesson she gives that day is lighter, freer, and the students respond more warmly. She realizes that her old belief about sacrifice did not serve anyone. This is how testing a belief can transform even the smallest ordinary day. The pragmatic method does not ask you to abandon logic. It invites you to combine it with observation. It turns your daily life into a field of quiet experiments. You do not need to declare your faith in new ideas. You simply live them for a while and let the results speak. You can test forgiveness by acting with gentleness towards someone who hurt you and noticing if peace grows or not. You can test ambition by working without self-hatred and seeing if success feels richer. The key is to replace judgment with curiosity, because curiosity keeps you moving and judgment keeps you stuck. Another story begins with a young man convinced that failure means he is worthless. Every setback feels like proof that he should stop trying. He lives in constant comparison with others until one day a friend challenges him to measure worth differently. For 1 week, she says, count effort, not results. Keep score of how many times you show up with sincerity even when things go wrong. He tries it reluctantly, and by the end of that week something changes. He feels pride again, not because everything worked, but because he realized he could keep going. The belief that failure equals worthlessness failed its test. He did not find perfection, but he found resilience, and that is more real than any abstract idea of success. When you practice the pragmatic method, you begin to see that beliefs are not enemies. They are teachers. Each one has a lifespan. Some serve for a time, then need to be released. The pain of letting go comes from confusing the belief with the self. But you are not your beliefs. You are the awareness testing them. The mind may resist this because it wants stability, but true stability comes from flexibility. The tree that survives storms is the one that bends, not the one that stays rigid. The same is true of the human spirit. One of the most profound effects of this method is how it changes your relationship with conflict. You stop arguing to prove who is right and start asking what works better. You stop treating disagreement as threat and begin to see it as more data to consider. The energy once spent defending your opinions becomes available for growth. Instead of saying you are wrong, you begin to say, interesting, that doesn't work for me, but tell me what it gives you. This shift alone can turn enemies into teachers because it replaces ego with exploration. Testing beliefs also invites you to reclaim responsibility for your own reality. When you see that ideas shape experience, you stop waiting for the world to change first. You realize that how you frame something changes what it becomes. A difficult person can be seen as punishment or as training in patience. A delay can be seen as rejection or as timing that protects you. The method teaches you that reality is partly built by participation, not merely endured. There was once a nurse who believed that her job demanded constant giving without recognition. She felt unseen until she tried one experiment for 7 days. She would acknowledge herself at the end of every shift with a small ritual, a deep breath, a whispered thank you to her own hands. By the end of the week, her exhaustion began to feel different. The patients were the same, the hours the same, but her energy changed. She realized the belief that worth must be proven through suffering was false when tested with kindness. That small internal shift radiated outward, and others began to treat her with the same respect she now gave herself. The pragmatic method teaches that change does not come from grand revelations, but from repeated, small tests of reality. Every day becomes a quiet laboratory. You test patience in traffic, courage in conversation, self-respect in boundaries. These experiments do not require success, only awareness. Awareness itself is progress because it returns. Choice to you. As you continue this path, you begin to see that truth is not a possession. It is a practice. You no longer cling to ideas out of fear. You live them until they lose or earn their place, and then you move on. There is humility in this, and great peace. The ego that once demanded to be right softens into the heart that only wants to see clearly. The world becomes less about proof and more about participation. Each sunrise becomes a new chance to test a gentler, more life-giving way to think, and in that practice the ordinary turns luminous again. There comes a quiet moment after all the testing, after all the trying, when you realize that the goal was never to find the perfect belief, but to become a person who can keep learning. The pragmatic method is not a system to follow. It is a way of living that keeps your mind open and your heart awake. Every belief you have ever held, whether about love, success, or failure, has been a story meant to guide you, but no story can contain the whole truth. The only truth that lasts is the one that works right now, the one that helps you live with more clarity, courage, and care. William James wanted people to stop fighting over who was right and start asking what helps life grow, what deepens understanding, what makes us kinder. When you live this way, something shifts inside. You stop fearing mistakes because mistakes are simply data. You stop worshipping perfection because perfection ends the experiment. You realize that life itself is the test ground for meaning, and you are both the scientist and the subject. You watch your thoughts like weather patterns, some heavy, some light, and instead of clinging, you let them pass through. The freedom here is subtle but deep, because it means you are no longer trapped by your own mind. You can hold a belief and still breathe through it. You can let it serve you and then let it go. Imagine waking each morning, not needing to prove anything, not needing to defend who you are, but only to see what works today. You might still feel fear, but it becomes part of the data. You might still stumble, but even falling becomes part of the experiment. This kind of living does not remove pain, but it removes unnecessary suffering because you no longer fight reality. You cooperate with it. You listen. You learn as the days pass. You begin to feel a gentle calm that comes from knowing you are allowed to evolve. You are not betraying your past by changing your mind. You are honoring your present. By staying alive to experience the pragmatic method reminds you that growth is not measured by how right you are, but by how honestly you respond to what life shows you. Testing your beliefs again and again does not make you weak. It makes you whole. So, tonight when the noise quiets down, ask yourself one simple question. What belief have I never tested because I was afraid of what I might find? Then whisper to yourself that it is safe to begin. The mind that experiments is the mind that heals. The heart that stays curious never hardens. This is how truth grows, through living, through daring, through gentle repeated experiments in being human. And when you finally realize that every test, no matter how small, brings you closer to what truly works, for your soul you will see that the search for truth was never out there. It was always here in the way you meet this very moment, with awareness and courage. That is the quiet revolution of the pragmatic method, not in finding eternal certainty, but in learning how to live gracefully within uncertainty and still choose meaning the end.